All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third meeting of the UPSFF Working Group. My name is Ryan Arori, and I'm the Director of Budget and Finance at OSSI. I'm going to start with roll call. So I'm going to read everyone's name going in alphabetical order, and can you just respond and just let us know that you're here? So first, Michael Bayek.
I am here, thank you.
Great. Josh Boots.
Here.
Abe Clayman.
Here.
Chelsea Coffin. Saw Chelsea here before. Maybe she's away from her computer. Jen Comey.
Here, thanks.
Great. Jeanette Fernandez.
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Great. Let's see. Alan Francois from DCPS. Don't see him on the list, on the attendee list. Sharon Gaskins from DCPS. No. Okay. Jessica Giles.
Present.
Great. William Henderson. He said he wasn't going to make it today. Kubila Huddleston. So Leicester Johnson is not here, but Jamie, can you just say hi real quick to the group?
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm serving as assessor's proxy today.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Mary Levy. I don't see Mary. Jack McCarthy.
I am here.
Great. And Alonzo Montalvo. Not here. Stephen Regis. Also not here. Kathy Riley. Kathy, I see you on the list. Can you just make sure your mic's working? Okay, maybe you're having audio issues too. Allison Rode from DCPS.
Present.
Great. Justin Rydstrom. No.
Justin asked if there's a PNS password. I'm going to text it to him.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh. Nate Schwartz.
Here.
Great. Atima Shahi.
I'm here.
Great. Welcome. Did Ashley make it on? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, Ashley. Drew Snyder.
I'm here.
Great. Raymond Whedon. No, Raymond. Jonathan Weinstein. I think he said he wasn't going to be here. Okay. Kevin Wenzel from TCPS.
Here, thank you.
Great. And Margie Yeager.
Arrived. Sorry to be late. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Okay. So as I said, this is our third working group meeting. The session is being recorded. We do ask if you can to keep your camera on, especially if you are speaking. There is a chat feature. So when you're using the chat feature, just make sure that you are sending your chat to everyone and not to just one person, so that everyone can see it. This is a public meeting, so we will have a public comment session towards the end of the meeting for anyone that is attending from the public that wants to make a comment. And I think we're ready to start. Is there anything I'm forgetting? We have Michelle, Yan, and Patrice Swift-Taylor from the DME, along with myself as the facilitators for today's session.
Awesome. So we're today, Patrice can go back one slide. We are just going to do a quick recap of the October meeting since I know it's been a little bit of time, give everyone a refresher. We'll spend a bit of time diving into the adult school weight. If folks remember, that was bulk of our conversation. There were several questions and next steps that folks had recommended coming out of that. So we will return to that. And then spend a little bit of time talking about the middle school weight, which was one of the other proposed topics and weights to tackle for this working group. And then we will leave time at the end for public comment. I do see that we do have several attendees, so that will be an opportunity for folks to chime in and share their perspective as well. Great, so just a few of the big items from the October meeting that we want to just remind folks of. We spent a bit of time talking about the adult school weight, and specifically there were questions around understanding a bit more about how adult school operations look and what adult school accountability looks like as we think about the connections between funding and performance, and an interest in just understanding what the adult school recommendations were within the adequacy study. And then finally, this was a bit more broad, just as we were talking about multiple weights, but understanding the relative costs of increasing different weights and giving folks a better sense of the population impacted and then what that incremental dollar looks like. So we will spend a bit of time on each of these three, both in the context of the adult school weight, as well as when we talk about the middle school weight. We'll share a bit of those numbers as well, so that folks have some of that context. So we are going to start with the adult school weight. I sent a couple of days ago 2 documents that Ashley very helpfully helped compile in partnership with some other adult schools to provide a bit of background and context for what adult schools look like today, the student population served, some of the common challenges faced, and what accountability looks like within adult schools. So I'm sure some folks maybe had a chance to review, others maybe did not. So we are going to spend a little bit of time just doing an overview there, and I'll turn it over to Ashley, but would also encourage our panelists to chime in with any questions as we are going through that section, either based on in-the-moment reactions or things that folks read in the 2 really wonderful comprehensive memos. So I will turn it over to Ashley.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about adult education during this meeting. I've been involved with adult education in DC since 2005, both as a teacher, administrator, and now someone focused on research and policy for an adult serving charter school. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions. I know our time is limited today, so I also just wanted to say at the outset that I'm more than happy to meet with folks outside of this meeting or answer questions via email if that is helpful for you. I think we can go to the next slide. So what we'll be looking at today, we just pulled some bullet points of information that we thought might be pertinent to our discussion out of those 2 documents that we sent you earlier in the week. Just as a refresher, the first one was an overview of adult education in the district with some demographic information as well as programmatic information. And the second was more focused on how adult schools are funded through the UPSFF for additional background information. So starting on that first topic, during the fiscal year 22 audit, so last fall, which is the most recent year we have complete information for, hopefully, in the coming months, we'll obviously have information from this fall, but from last year, adult schools served over 5,000 students, and this was an 8% increase from fall of 21, which I think is worth noting here because, as we know, last school year was still somewhat tumultuous, not super normal, and so to be able to have that increase and be back at our kind of pre-pandemic enrollment is quite notable, particularly because that wasn't the case for all grade bands. It was more challenging at some other grades to enroll. Along these same lines, it's important to note that adult learners are a very mobile population. Education, while adult education is part of the public education system in DC, it is not compulsory, so they're not required to be in school, obviously. And they may need to stop out of school for periods of time, just given the nature of their life and things going on outside of school. And this might be to work, to take care of a family member, or address a medical need, say the birth of a child. And adult schools are pretty active at filling those vacant seats from their waitlist when any of those students leave. That, of course, means that there's an additional administrative burden to onboard those students, orient them, give them their computers or devices for learning, and then integrate them into the learning environment. And we talked to a couple adult schools to get this statistic, but we estimate that about 20% of students fluctuate after the audit in the fall. That same year, so in 2021, of all those adult students that I cited at the top, over 5,000, 92% of them attended DC public charter schools. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the programming there, but generally they serve students in the areas of literacy, English as a second language, high school diploma, and workforce development. And then the remaining 8% of adult learners attend one of DCPS's opportunity academies, the state schools, or more. And those offer as well personalized competency-based learning programs for students 16 years or older who are at least 6 credits behind in their high school education. Go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, charter schools and DC Opportunity Academies offer pathways to high school diploma, either through the GED or the National External Diploma Program, which is a competency-based portfolio assessment, really geared towards adult learners so that they can demonstrate their knowledge and career readiness through specific tasks. Students in adult education schools also train and earn credentials to gain family-sustaining work in several industries, including education, construction, hospitality, healthcare, and technology. And there are several schools that do this while providing additional ESL support or bilingual curriculum for these workforce development programs. In addition to academic programming, many adult schools also support the non-academic needs of their students through wraparound supports. We understand that the students in adult schools may face some barriers that could limit them to fully engaging in their learning, so we want to work with them to eliminate those barriers in any way we can. That might be getting assistance through public benefits, accessing healthcare, getting nutritional assistance, mental health support, gaining employment, taking parenting classes, getting transportation, or even consultation on immigration-related issues. And on the accountability piece for adult charter schools, the performance management framework, the PMF, as it is for all charter schools, evaluates adult schools on student progress, achievement, college and career readiness, attendance, persistence, as well as mission-specific goals. Worth noting here is that adult learners also take standardized assessments both at the time of school entry, whenever they enter through the school year, and then are post-tested at regular intervals throughout the year to measure their growth. And I think now is when I pass it back to you, Michelle. I saw things popping up in the chat, but I wasn't reading them. Are there any questions?
Yeah, and I think this slide will also actually help to answer some of the questions. There was just a question from Kathy Riley in the chat around ages that adult charter schools serve. So are they serving students 16 and older? And Jamie responded that some adult schools serve students starting at age 16.
Yeah, and just to highlight this chart that you see in front of you now, this came from memo number 1. So it's there if you want to read it a little bit more in depth or need larger text, but these are the adult serving schools in DC. It has information about the wards where they're located, the ages of the students they serve, their program offerings, and what their audited enrollment was for last school year.
So I think it'd be great to pause here and see if there are any questions from folks that we can help answer.
Could I ask? Oh, can you hear me? Oh dear.
You seem.
Sorry, I'll put it in the chat. I don't know why. Let me take care of it.
Could other folks try to mute? It might be, maybe it's echoing between multiple.
I think I'm on twice. Is that better? No.
Oh, I see. Kathy, if you're logged in twice,
I know I'm trying to find where the other one is.
I have the opportunity to expel your other one if you want me to try that.
Yes.
Okay, so don't be mad at me if I mess something up, but I'm going to expel your other one.
Got that?
Yeah, I think it worked. Can you say?
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Perfect.
I was gonna ask, like, I think in the DCPS schools for the students that are 16 to 18, they receive the weights that are appropriate for high school students that are 16 to 18. So in these schools where they accept students, even, over 14 or 16, do they make that distinction? And if not, why not? And maybe Kevin can say if my understanding of that is correct.
Yeah, I think we said something similar last time, but I'm trying to track back to it, which is, OSSI promulgates the alternative regulations, and from that, the financial identification of who receives what is what we utilize. So the state schools, not all of them, but at least 2 of them, have both alternative students and adult students as defined by the promulgated regulations from OSSI for financial reasons.
And I think just to clarify, Kathy, so there's no students attending the stay schools that are receiving like a high school weight, like a 12th grade or 11th grade.
Yeah, they are, right? Kevin, aren't they receiving it? I guess my
If they are alternative, yeah, if they're alternative for the, from in the standards aligned, financial standards aligned alternative definition, then they will receive, which effectively the alternative weight is the high school weight plus the at-risk weight. So yes, they are receiving what a high school student in an alternative setting would receive.
And the alternative settings are also the
Are the stays. That's right.
stays. So I guess I'm kind of just trying to figure out what our definition of adult is. Since we do fund students up to 18 and actually up to 18, I think, so I'm just curious why these schools that have students under 18 don't get the money for them like they were regular high school students. I can't see how many would fall into that category, but it might. I know for us, it's more than one would think.
And I guess just to speak a little bit about like how the alternative funding weight works, because there are some schools that receive both alternative weights for some students and adult weights for other students. A school will receive the alternative weight if they are deemed by OSSI to have met the requirements for being an alternative school, and if those students are attending full-time and on track to receive a secondary academic credential, then they would be eligible to receive the alternative weight. So for a lot of the school programs, if a student is attending part-time or is not on track for a secondary academic credential, then they would fall into the adult weight category.
Yeah, and I think one other just point I want to reiterate is, the UPSFF funds the LEA, and then we distribute funds down, a multi-campus LEA will then distribute funds via resources down to the different schools based on the allocation methodologies that each LEA chooses. So I think there's not, we do a very clear through line, for example, on the alternative weight because it has a corollary to the at-risk weight. And similar to how we distribute at-risk funds in fiscal 23 and beyond as flexible grants, we do a similar thing for alternative, but it's as a function of at-risk because that's what alternative is meant to be. I think you raise a good question, Kathy, which is like a kind of working definition, if there is not one specific like there was in for alternative, is that it's students that attend these schools that are not alternative students, right? So, but that might not be the right definition, and maybe there's an opportunity to better define that group if there is some ambiguity there.
Yeah, I guess you hear what I'm struggling with, that, if we have 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, they should get what they deserve. So I can see that a lot of these schools most of them have students that are 16 and 17 and 18. So I think our definition of adult and how these are all LEAs, I assume they could make the same distinction that DCPS does and say, and I would assume that I would think the 16 and 17-year-olds would be enrolling in order to get, either high school or, you figure that out. I don't, so I'm curious.
Yeah, I
And
do
for
think
us,
that that's
what our
mostly,
definition of adult is. What is our
I
definition
think
of
that's
adult?
important. Yeah, and I think for us, my assumption, I don't have the data in front of me. My assumption is that a 16-year-old that's at Baloo Day is likely being categorized not as an adult student, but as an alternative student.
Right.
I don't have it in front of me, but adult student is defined in the DC code. I can go look it up if
I'm trying to pull it up.
okay, thanks. I linked it in the bottom of, I think, memo number 1, if you happen to have that open.
I can look at that.
So it's a 16-year-old who attends Baloo is going to be eligible for different money, or not that student, but a 16-year-old at Baloo will get a pot of funding that a 16-year-old at Bria. That's not, maybe that's another example.
Well, the 16-year-old kid has every right to the same funding. It just has to be applied that way.
Right. I'm hearing different definitions of like alternative versus adult, which is confusing me a little bit.
Yeah, I do think it'd be helpful for us to see the adult definition and the alternative definition side by side, because as I mentioned on the, I can't speak on the charter side, but on the DCPS side, at the state schools, we have students that are both, right? They're not each both, but we have an adult population and an alternative population in those schools based on the standards of what, programming they're in, their age, et cetera. And that's kind of the way that we think about it.
I'm not sure if this is helpful, and I did put it in the chat, but the definition of an adult public charter school is one that's held accountable to the Adult Performance Management Framework through PCSB. So there's a PMF that's applicable to adult schools, and that's how you get categorized.
That's completely different than OSCE's definition for funding purposes, so we should not use that at all.
I can read out loud. I mean, I'll drop it in the chat. It's the link to the code itself. The adult education is defined at the very top. Means services or instructions below the college level for adults who lack sufficient mastery in basic educational skills to enable them to function effectively in society, do not have a certificate of graduation from a school providing secondary education, and who have not achieved an equivalent level of education, or have limited ability to speak in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language, and whose native language is a language other than English. I am not seeing anywhere that provides an age. And then alternative program is specialized instruction for students under court supervision or who have a history of being on short or long-term suspension, or who have been expelled from school, or who meet other criteria as defined by the state education office through rulemaking. In order to qualify as an alternative program, a school must meet the criteria and rules set by the state education office. An alternative program may describe an entire school or a specialized program within a school.
Michelle, I think the question is, are there 16, 17, 18-year-olds at adult schools not working towards GED or high school diploma and are working on some sort of certification program and therefore are funded at the adult rate instead of anything else?
And I think the answer is yes, there are. Like I'm just looking at this list, and for example, Bria is not an approved alternative school. So if they have a 16 or a 17-year-old that's attending, then I'm pretty sure that Bria would be receiving the adult weight for those students. Same with Carlos Rosario, where it also says that they have ages 16 and up. So Carlos Rosario is not an approved alternative school.
Berea only receives adult education payment for our adult ed students. We don't receive we don't receive high school or alternative.
Is there a barrier to creating an alternative school category of students within the school, like for Berea? Like if you have students that really are there to get their GED or to move along and get a diploma or whatever, is there some reason that Berea, like DCPS, wouldn't, I don't know what the barrier is to also having alternatives so that you get the higher funding for those students.
I can tell you it would be in the single digits, if any, students for us. Berea's a 2-generation school, so you have to be a parent to enroll in our program. So that right there, not that you can't be a parent at 16, that's totally possible, but our students I think our average age is like in the mid to upper 20s somewhere. We very rarely serve teenagers. But I don't know if your question is about, is there a mechanism to apply for that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, not having any idea what the numbers are, it just seems like we're actually talking about younger students in this range. And then, students like you're describing that clearly fall into with adult issues and that you're serving them. Just curious about how this works.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I am a little conscious of our time. And I'm worried that this is a slight deviation from the actual topic of adult education funding. I don't want to step on your toes, Michelle, but I'm wondering if we could look into this maybe after the meeting and get back to Kathy.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines, just understanding the requirements for being able to access alternative funding. I do believe some of the adult charter schools have explored some of this, so we can come back in the next working group and share a little bit of what we learned there. If it's of like the working group's interest to pursue understanding of, are there ways for adult charter schools to access alternative funding for some of their student populations, which I think is some of what I'm hearing from some folks. Any other go ahead.
Michelle, isn't there already a process for applying for alternative status under the regulations promulgated by OSSI? Maybe that's a Ryan question.
Yes, there is a process. There's an annual application process.
Right.
So
Okay.
there are some schools that have chosen not to partake in that process, but any school could partake in the application process, and we would have to review it to make sure that it meets the requirements in order to be approved. So it could be the case that some of the schools on this list are not applying because they will not meet the requirements to become an alternative school.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Any other final thoughts on this before we move on to the next slide? Great. All right, so on the next slide, this then is seeking to address, I think, one of the questions that was raised around the adequacy study. So on the left-hand side, what we've pulled out for here is just a snapshot of a portion of the adequacy study recommendation for space sake, but the entire list, what is missing here is just the administrative staff. This shows the instructional staff and the student support staff. So the adequacy study broke it out by individual staff type. And what it provides is the recommendation from the adequacy study on the number of staff members to serve a school of 500 full-time students, full-time adult students. And so, for example, you'll see for teachers, it says there should be 22.2 teachers per every 500 students. That comes out roughly to a class size of 1 teacher per 22 students. Similarly, if you go down to student support staff, it recommends 16.7 staff members per 500 students. That flipped ratio, it would be about 30 students per individual staff member. And then on the right-hand side, what we have done is we've taken a case study of an individual adult charter school and looked at what in reality their staffing model actually looks like given the current funding levels. And so they took their entire staffing model, bucketed it into each of the adequacy study buckets to look at, what are we able to support right now given our funding level. I will caveat all of this with this is one adult school example that was able to offer some of their information. I think we recognize in both the K-12 and adult spaces, schools are going to make individual decisions on how they choose to staff and fund their schools, but we wanted to provide an example of what this looks like in reality and operationally. So when we bucketed the staff members in, we saw that, I'll just talk about the one that's not on the page, which is administrative, came in relatively close, within 10% of what the adequacy study recommendation was. But total instructional staff at the school was about 40% lower than the adequacy study recommends. And so, again, to bring this to life a bit, for 500 students, we would have said 22 staff members. In reality, that is a little bit closer to 14, for example. In particular, instructional aides were about 50 to 60% lower than the adequacy study. So rather than 16 to 17 instructional aides for a school of 500 students, that is looking closer to 8 to 9. And then student support staff, which is one of the ones that we've highlighted here, was 80% lower than what the adequacy study would recommend. So there were significantly fewer student support staff. And then in totality, the total number of students per instructional staff was closer to 18 to 20 students per instructional staff, compared to the adequacy study of 11.7, and then 8 to 10 students per total staff, compared to the adequacy study of 6.2. And again, sharing all of this with a caveat that this is an example of one adult school that has made staffing decisions in a particular way. Other schools can make staffing, salary, programmatic decisions in different ways, but wanted to help folks see just what some of this ends up looking like in practice. The adequacy study ratios 500 full-time students, taking into account the full-time definition for adult students. And yes, they only count any students in the UPSFF that are full-time students. And this school, oh, I see what your question, like, are in their total staffing, are they considering other students in what they're supporting?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the apples to apples between the left side of the screen and the right side in terms of what the adequacy studies scope was of who they're comparing, and on the right, yeah.
Yes, yeah, for this school, yes.
And Michelle, what percent of the adequacy study funding weight are we giving them? So like you're saying these are all some X percent below what was recommended in the adequacy study, but it's also their funding rate.
So right now we are providing a 0.91 weight for FY23. Prior to that, it has been a 0.89 weight for the years going all the way back to the adequacy study. And the adequacy study itself recommends a 1.0 weight. So it's been historically 0.89 versus 1.0.
And that the amount is actually the recommended base weight, which we haven't hit either, plus that weight, correct? So it's potentially more than just, we're underfunding just 10%, it's more than 10%.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't have that number exactly off the top of my head. Awesome. So based on this, I think one thing that was notable was the gaps, particularly for instructional aides and student support staff. So the next page provides a bit more examples from several adult schools on the ways that instructional aides and student support staff are utilized. These are non-exhaustive examples, but also try to highlight, I think, some of the more adult-specific elements of the ways that these staff members are supporting students. So for instructional aides, one thing that was notable was that oftentimes there are multiple home languages within one classroom. So the instructional aides are intended to provide more targeted language supports for the English language learner population. And then providing differentiated instruction through small group and or pull-out instruction, which I'm sure many folks will be familiar with as a strategy, with a note that oftentimes in classrooms, we have a range of prior educational experiences in the same classroom. Providing digital literacy support for students to support with job seeking, life skill attainment, applying for jobs, etc., proctoring exams, and then preparing instructional materials, which I think are more consistent. And then for the school support staff, again, these are non-exhaustive examples, providing adult students with support in accessing government resources. So for example, one school indicated that their school support staff are responsible for ensuring that every one of their students has transportation benefits, or is helping them apply for housing benefits if they also need to access that, particularly for folks who might be new to the country. Providing intervention supports for mental health, for career coaching, interviewing, resume review, etc. Supporting with potential barriers to learning through referrals to partner organizations. So connecting them to other organizations that may be able to continue to support them outside of the adult education environment. Supporting with extracurricular activities, helping develop transition plans. So as folks are exiting, connecting them to education, workforce, training opportunities, and then related following up with students post-exit. So as part of the performance management framework, understanding where students are going after they exit the adult school. So that would include determining whether they're employed, whether they've entered into higher education, and also potentially looking to whether they require additional supports in order to continue to achieve their goals. I'm going to pause here again for any questions, reactions from folks. And then Ashley, Jamie, if there's anything that you would add.
I did want to add one thing. I had the chance to talk to a couple of adult schools, Goodwill Excel, LAYC, and those are the two that come to mind right now in preparation for a conference on reading. And they really highlighted the career coaching aspect, particularly at Goodwill. Just the need to really sit down with someone and say, you're here, here's where you want to be in the future, and we're really going to help you every step of the way. And I just know, from where I sit in my role at the Federal City Council, that kind of workforce piece of helping people get into a job, get the skills they need to get into a job, and then stay in a job was really, really critical. So it came up over and over again, this kind of career coach, life coach, wraparound support piece, which was something I just hadn't really realized, because I think I thought of it as grade 13 or 14, but there's really a sort of a different set of needs that you're talking about.
All right, hearing no other questions, I'm going to move it to the next slide, which then helps to quantify some of this. So starting on the left-hand side, our foundation level for FY23, 12,419. The top flow shows the current adult weight of 0.91, multiplied by the number of adult students we have in the system right now is about $57.5 million in adult funding. If that weight were increased to 1.0, for example, that would be an additional $1,117 per student, equating to $63.2 million in adult funding. So that's a total financial impact of $5.6 million to bring it from a 0.91 to a 1.0 weight.
And just to clarify, we're using the FY23 foundation amounts, but that the 5,090 students, that is from last year's enrollment audit count for the number of adult students that were in the UPSFF adult weight.
Oh, can we go back slide?
I'm just quite curious about one thing. Just, it seems like from the needs even that Mr. Clayman was saying, and that 5,090 students is a small amount of what we have of need in this city in terms of adults that have either dropped out of high school or are in a category that would benefit from these programs. So this is not a confined number. It's how many we have right now, but at least from the needs that you're describing, it could be a huge number in terms of our commitment to serving the adults of the city with these kinds of services. So I mean, I think it's an amazing thing that our city can do this. So I'm surprised it's only 5,000 students giving the need. And it's something that we should probably consider.
Chelsea Coppin asked, I think, to your point, Kathleen, how close adult schools are to their enrollment ceilings. So in a similar vein, like what the capacity looks like. I don't know that off of the top of my head. PCSB, I don't know if you know for the adult charter schools what we're looking like, or some of the individual schools on this call.
Well, we could see what the current capacity is, but we have no limit on future capacity right now. So I guess I'm just highlighting that we're dipping into an area beyond K-12 or pre-K-12 or that we want to serve, but it is a huge area. So I'm happy to go on and look at the middle school weight, but I just am struck by what a small percentage of the students that have dropped out of high school or that our needs aren't being met in terms of literacy or job or all the things that were described here. We're not meeting those needs. And we're not at the adequacy level. Maybe the other question is, are we at the adequacy study level, which is now, that study will be redone. Are we at that level in any other area?
Kathy, I think, thanks for bringing this up. I think the reason why I mentioned the enrollment ceilings, I wasn't sure if you were trying to say like this might be a huge, we might see huge swings from year to year in the budget. My understanding is in general that adult schools are pretty close to those ceilings. And so it would require some kind of a change to increase the capacity in terms of the shift in the budget from year to year. And others on the call can probably speak better to this, but these adult public charter schools are one actor in this space. So I don't think this isn't the only way that adults are being served in DC. It's a really critical way. Anyway.
No, I think, thank you. I mean, to Kevin's, I guess this is the other question. Where does that 5.6 million come from? Or whatever the amount is to serve the adult students. I understand we have certain capacity right now. I guess I was just looking at the need versus the capacity. And if part of what we're looking at, if this is a need, we are saying we're going to meet, does it affect what we're doing in any other area? And those are the thoughts. It's just a lot. So to Kevin's question, and maybe you can answer this, Ryan, is it a trade-off? If we put additional money here, does it come out of something else?
I mean, I think in the big picture of things are always a trade-off, right? Like we are always confined by the fiscal reality of the city. So regardless of dollar size, there will always be a trade-off of some type. I did a check of for that $5.6 million. If we were to just run that through the foundation level, I didn't do the other ways, but just like for perspective, to run it through the foundation level and say we want to spend this $5.6 million on increasing the foundation level instead, what the impact of that would be. It's about a $30 to $40 increase in the foundation level, or a 0.25% change to the foundation level itself. So for a per student dollar amount, instead of $12,419, it's closer to like $12.50 to $12.55 to actually run it through the foundation level. So if you were thinking about those two trade-offs, that's what it would look like.
But wait, you're saying to get to this $5.6 million increase to the adult student, like the payment total, that it would be about $30 to $40. I mean, I think that
not to get to the adult payment total, to get to, so if we wanted to increase the adult weight to 1.0, it would cost 5.6 million.
Right.
If we were to take that 5.6 million and say, we just want to spend 5.6 million to increase the foundation level of the entire formula.
Oh, I see.
It would then flow through to all of the weights. Yep.
But then in that scenario, the adult weight would be 0.91 still.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think all I'm voicing, Jeanette, to your point, like, or that your question is, at the end of the day, like, we can increase the foundation level, we can increase the weights, we can do those things. To me, when we're thinking, you know, part of my challenge and why I'm excited about a new adequacy study is that the 2014 adequacy study, you know, we have so many changes that have been incorporated in the last 10 years that weren't even contemplated in the same way. We have 4 different at-risk weights. We have lots of different needs, I think. And so I just always want to put this in the context of, you know, from an LEA perspective, is it that we want to target a specific, I think this is the big trade. Do you want to target a very specific group, or do you want a broader, you know, increase for everyone? And I think that, to me, it would need to be really compelling to choose the very small group over increasing proportionally, which already happens through the UPSFF, an increase scenario.
I could address that. I really encourage us not to think of adult learners as a specific niche group. These learners are parents of kids enrolled in K-12 schools. They are the employees at frontline workplaces. This is not an investment in just some far off group. They are directly tied to the success of DC and kids in particular.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that we shouldn't think about their needs. I just think what I'm saying is we should think about it in the broader context of, you know, if there's a trade-off between giving the dollar to the second or third grader or giving it to their parent, that is a real trade-off. And I think we have to think about that context when we're talking about targeting different funds. They certainly have needs, and I acknowledge that. But I think it's part of a broader conversation that I think we need to have as part of this group.
Yeah, I guess I'm just encouraging us to think of the investment in the parent as an investment in the child. When you help a parent learn how to read better, they're able to help their child with their homework. They're able to encourage their child to stay in school. They have a direct, research proves it, literacy in their mother directly impacts literacy in a child. It is not an investment just in the parent. An investment in adult education is investment in both the parent and the child.
Understood. Yep. Thank you.
I would like to
There's
say
a
one thing.
multiplication factor that I think you're trying to talk about, Jamie.
Sorry, I missed the first part of what you said.
I was just saying there's a multiplication factor with adult students in particular that I think you're kind of getting at. And it's in the K-12 space, but it's also in like job attainment and the larger economy as well.
Absolutely. If the sister were here, she would say this is a conversation about and, not or. We are investing in their parent, the adult, and their child and community, not one or the other.
If I could say one thing about funding, I do think while the adequacy study, a lot has changed. If we look at the second memo around funding, there's a table there that pretty clearly shows how much more money each category of student is getting for FY23 than what the adequacy study recommended. And if we look closely at that, we'll see that, for example, a kindergarten student is being funded at almost $5,600 more than what was recommended by the adequacy study. And as a former kindergarten teacher, I have no problem with that. At the same time, an adult student is being funded at $700 more than what the adequacy study recommended 9 years ago. And so I think, there's a pretty stark disparity between where the other categories are and where adult and to a certain extent where alternative students are. And I think that, I definitely see Kevin's point. I just would say when there's such a pretty stark imbalance like that, it just kind of seems like there should be something should change there. I mean, if I could respond to Kevin's question, I think, yes, there's trade-offs. I think Kevin clearly identified if we fund X more next year, we have less for Y. And I hear that, but I think, we relied on, this is the study we have. And so it just seems like, one is 10 times more than above what the adequacy study recommended as compared to another. That just seems, I don't have a justification for that. And some people say, oh, look at the weight, and some people say, look at the dollar amount. But however you slice it, this group seems to be getting underfunded compared to the others.
And I don't think it's on us to find the money or say where it should come from. Like, our group is really tasked with just making recommendations on the UPSFF. It's not our job to balance the budget.
I think it's our job to figure out how to be fair. So that's what we're struggling with.
Yeah, I would second that, Kathy. I think of I could be wrong, but I think of this group as trying to make sure that the formula is as equitable and meeting the needs of the unique programs that each component of it serves. But I could be wrong. Are there, that was my next question, and maybe this is a question for Aussie or DME. Are there other areas of the formula that we are scheduled to look at in this season or year of meeting? I'm not trying to rush to them. I'm just trying to orient myself, because I do think Kevin's point is a good one, that there is a larger landscape, and it would be good to just kind of know what is on the horizon for our analysis.
Yeah, I would hope we would talk about special education at some point during these discussions too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think middle school and special education are the two other ones that have been raised. So we'll spend a little bit of time today previewing the middle school one. And then I would like to spend some time at the end, Jack, to your point, just talking about what we want to investigate with special education. I think it is one of the most complex ones. And I want to make sure we are targeted in what we try to look for there as well, so that we can make sure to look into the right things. Anything else on the adult weight before we do turn it over to the middle school side of things? All right, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And this is our first conversation about the middle school weights. So what we have planned is a few slides that are looking at the recent assessment data that has been released and comparing that to previous year's assessment data, just to sort of like set the landscape, where then we can talk about changes to the actual funding. So a lot of the slides that we're going to share are dealing with Park and NAEP, and obviously this data is released by OSSI. A lot of the graphs and visuals that we are showing you are from the Empower K-12 dashboard from that website. So the first slide is comparing the district park scores from 2019 to 2022. And what we're looking at is the percentage of students that are at 3 or more proficiency. The left side is math, the right side is ELA, and it's broken down between elementary school, middle school, and high school. So if we look at the set of graphs on the left-hand side, where we're looking at math proficiency in 2019, it was 63%. In 2022, it's down to 45% in the elementary school category, which is a drop of 18. And then you'll see in the middle school went from 50 to 39. High school went from 40 to 32. So bigger gap in the elementary school. Then the middle school gap is present, a little bit smaller, and then high school gap is a little bit smaller than that too. On the ELA side, there was also a gap in elementary school and middle school, but actually an increase in high school. So just to help frame everyone about the differences that have happened since we started offering the assessment again. Obviously, there was a few years gap due to COVID. So Patrice, you can jump to the next slide. So this graph is also from the Empower K-12 website, the dashboard. And what we're showing here, this is just math, but it's looking at the gaps that were between 2019 and 2022 for a number of different student groups. So for example, the first line that you're seeing is the gap between at risk and not at risk. And again, it's broken down between elementary school, middle school, and high school. So the gap between at risk and not at risk in 2019 in an elementary school was 25. And that gap has increased to 39 in 2022, which is a change of 13.5. So there's an increase in the gap. And you can see that that is consistent across all of the grade bands for at risk, for Black and white, for Hispanic and white, where those gaps are getting larger. And in the bottom two rows, students with disabilities and students without disabilities, and English learners and not English learners. The gaps were getting smaller. So I'm just going to pause on this because there's a lot of information in this slide. And again, the focus that we wanted to look at is how does the performance in middle school compare to the performance in the other grade bands, to sort of frame a conversation about changes for the middle school weight. So we do have a couple more slides where we have some more assessment data, but I just want to pause and see if there's any discussion that folks want to raise based on the two slides that we've shared so far.
Is there a story behind any of these changes that you can give us more information about?
I'm pausing to see if anybody else wanted to jump in, if there's any like LEA leaders or anything that want to help sort of frame the conversation here.
I don't know what the story is, but it's interesting that students with disabilities and ELL, that statistic is interesting. And I'd also be curious, this is for elementary school 3 to 5. When we do the weights, do we do it that way also? I thought we did pre-K. Is that the way we define elementary schools, or do we do 1 to 5?
Pre-K 3 has a different weight than pre-K 4, and kindergarten have the same weight. And then right now, grades 1 through 5 all have a 1.0, and 6 through 8 have a middle school weight of 1.08.
So I am, since it's
So it somewhat aligns, yeah.
well, the 1 point, I'd be curious with the 1 to 5. Kurt, as you look at this, the elementary schools took a bigger hit over COVID.
Mm-hmm. And coming up in a few slides, Kathy, we do share we're going to reshare the slide that we showed last time that shows how the weights for each of the grade bands have changed over the past, 10, 15 years, I want to say. But we'll share that slide in a little bit.
I think the reason we wanted to look at middle schools was because as the high school data was, so disturbing, that we wanted to figure out, is there some way we can are we doing enough earlier before the students get to high school? We certainly need to do it when they get to high school, but that's why the middle school weight did come up. And because historically, sometimes we've had that come up.
Ryan, I just have a data question for the, I'm wondering if you saw any different trends for 4+. I don't want to nitpick, but I think that's usually the proficiency cutoff when I think about it. And so just wondering if you chose why you chose to look at 3 instead of 4. And I think for me, for middle school, we did see a big slide. So anyway, just wondering on that.
Mm-hmm. I think the best thing to say is we can share the 4+, because I think that showing both and giving you all more data to look at is probably a good idea. But I can't remember off the top of my head how much of a change looking at the 3+ and the 4+ is. But in general, like, I would say that the trends are similar.
And I was also waiting for an LEA leader to provide additional context, but I would say from what we've learned from our bold performance schools when we went into interviews is that students with disabilities and English learners were the first group of students that they tried to bring back in person, that they were those priority student groups that when buildings did somewhat reopen to a limited number of students, that they prioritized students with disabilities and English learners during the virtual year. And then, Abe, you're correct. Gaps grew in elementary school age band, right? Those are students who are less adapted to learning online. And I think that that's predominantly most of the stuff is related to the virtualness and what works and what doesn't work in the virtual world.
I think one thing I'm thinking, Kathy, from your, I think, very good push on, like, if you just look at this, the students that, the gaps grew most, if I'm reading this correctly, was at elementary school. The staticness of the formula, that it's tied to grade band. I wonder if this is a group that is going to just pass through all the way through as a cohort, and this gap is going to follow them when they're in middle school, when they're in high school, rather than us saying, well, for this point in time for this group, we needed to, we're going to change the weights for everyone forever moving forward. Or if there's a way to figure out how to target the kind of each group as they move through their entire schooling career, like if this gap is going to persist over time for them specifically, rather than it being a factor of them being in second grade, which I think is more what the formula tries to address rather than the kind of cohort thing I'm thinking of. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but that's what I'm thinking through.
Are you saying that the reason for these gaps growing is that kids in third grade spent first and second grade learning remotely and having their whole lives disrupted by the pandemic and everything that goes along with that?
Yeah, I'm almost saying like if the tool at the disposal of this group is to recommend a change to a grade specific weight, I think if what we're seeing here is that this cohort of students may move through with this gap all the way through their career, we wouldn't necessarily want to recommend that the second grade weight increase because that wouldn't follow the kid. By the time we implement it, they're going to be in, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, right? So I'm curious about the difference between the kind of cohort effect versus, the formula tends to distribute resources based on student type, not their experience as they're going through their schooling experience.
And if it's all right with everyone, I'll go through the next few slides because they're similar assessment data, and then we can continue the conversation. So these slides are showing our overall DC NAEP results, and this will show fourth grade math and reading and eighth grade math and reading. So among the four grade subject assessments, DC saw the largest decline in average scale score for fourth grade mathematics, while eighth grade reading scores held steady from 2019. And the DC NAEP results, they show similar patterns to the statewide PARC results in ELA and mathematics as compared to 2019. However, the PARC eighth grade ELA scores declined while the NAEP eighth grade reading scores remained flat. So you can see in the table between 2019 and 2022 for fourth grade math, there was a difference, a reduction by 12, fourth grade reading, reduction of 8, eighth grade math, a reduction of 10, and then, as we said, eighth grade reading remained flat. And you can go to the next slide. So this is just breaking it down a little bit further between the four different levels. So moving from left to right, the different color bands are below basic, at proficient, and at advanced. So what you'll see, similar to the previous slide, an increase in the number of students that are below basic, while the at basic and at proficient numbers are decreasing for fourth grade math, and a similar trend for eighth grade math, where the number of below basic is increasing, and the number of at basic and at proficient are decreasing. And sorry, these are all percentages too. So the total of all of this it gets you to 100. And you can go to the next slide, Patrice. And this is the same thing for reading, where at least on the fourth grade reading slide, there's an increase in the number of below basic. And for eighth grade reading, the differences are actually very, very small. There's only a slight change to the number of below basic. And I think we have a couple more slides. Yep. So again, these are NAEP scores. This one is specifically looking at eighth grade mathematics over the past 20 years, just showing that the scores for DC overall compared to large city overall compared to national public overall. And I believe the next slide is, yeah, eighth grade reading. So this is just a reminder of what the grade level UPSFF weights, the changes that we've seen over the past number of years. And again, when we were looking at this in fiscal year 08, there was a number of changes that happened in the following fiscal year. So fiscal year 08 is there just sort of to ground everyone. And there were some changes in fiscal year 2009 that saw increases to the pre-K 3 weight and the pre-K 4 and kindergarten weights. The elementary school weight actually went down by a little bit. Grades 4 to 5 stayed the same. There was a slight increase to the middle school weight. The high school weight went down by 0.01. Alternative weight went down by a little bit. Adult weight stayed the same. Special education weight has stayed the same. And then in fiscal year 2015, the change here was an increase to the middle school weight and an increase to the high school weight and the alternative weight and the adult weight. And then finally, in FY23, where we are now, the main change was a increase to the alternative weight and an increase to the adult weight. So before I jump to the next slide, I just want to see if there's any comments based on the assessment data that we've shared and just looking at the changes in the funding amounts over the past number of years, if there's any comments or thoughts for anybody.
Oh, just two things. I think it's interesting that would we wrestle with how do we deal with the pandemic and the learning, the differences that happened there. Do we put that into this formula, or is that something that we look to understand a different way rather than making it kind of a permanent thing? And the other thing that's striking is it's the grades 1 to 5 that have actually seen no increase. So that's just, in fact, a decrease in 1 to 3. And how do we didn't look at that, or it's just interesting that we didn't increase them at all. And actually their losses were greater. So those are just two comments.
I think to your question around like what is the role of the UPSFF in, let's say, tackling the pandemic? I mean, I think that is absolutely something that as we launch the adequacy study, we're thinking about, because there are some things where it's like, all right, the pandemic has maybe structurally changed how we operate our schools. I think technology is like a small but easy example there. And so where do we want to change weights accordingly? It also is a mechanism for incremental increases to schools, right? And so what do we actually know about when there are, let's call them like natural experiments of, all right, a system got a massive increase in money. What kind of student outcomes did that lead to? And what can we learn from those experiments to inform what we may want to do with public school funding? And should that be in changing a weight? Should that be in changing the foundation level over the course of a couple of years in a different way than we would normally? Should that be funding outside of the formula, but that all still goes to schools for a temporary period of time? And then separately, like as a system and as a city, how are we thinking about the other citywide resources that also contribute to this? Like what teacher training and professional development looks like, what those critical school supports look like that we want all schools to have. So I think it's a really important question. I think it's a very big question and something that we've been thinking about as we've been kind of crafting the scope of the adequacy study, to recognize that we don't want to necessarily just tackle this in the like traditional adequacy study way, but actually think through the unique point in time that we're in and the lever that we have here.
It's interesting what Chelsea said.
Yeah, and the timing of it all, knowing that when federal funds are gonna phase out.
Yeah, do we recommend a COVID wait for a certain number of years to acknowledge that this cohort moving through took a big hit?
And that is part of what happened this past year and what happened next year with the pandemic supplement fund. That was 2 years for FY23 and FY24. It's the same amount across the board per student.
Well,
maybe you weren't getting at this, maybe you were, of like whether that actually gets targeted.
The curious thing is, so is 2 years enough? As Kevin said, that cohort is moving through. It's going to take them a lot longer to move through than 2 years. So it's because I think everybody's afraid of when the ESSER money goes away, and what it's been doing. So I think that's a very interesting idea that Chelsea had. Do we look at a COVID wait to acknowledge that 2 years isn't enough? The 2 years remaining in the ESSER funding isn't enough.
I just want to
has her hand up.
Like, it does make me a little nervous to adjust a tool that is meant to withstand time. Like, it's meant to be a tool for longevity and to introduce the concept of a temporary thing. I think that's why the pandemic supplement fund felt a little more natural. I think, to Kevin and Kathy's point, like, this, you're right, this cohort is going to move through the system, and they're going to age into, you know, new grade bands and experience just a totally different, you know, there's just like, it's like everyone's going to forever define their lives as like pre and post COVID, right? It's just kind of the nature of a global pandemic, I suppose. But I don't know that a tool like this is the space to deal with that, only because we are talking about a cohort.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, I do think that it's important to consider the impact of, or what will happen when the ESSER money goes away. I know everyone's thinking about that. Maybe that's something that is wrapped in, Michelle, already to the adequacy study, or it's something that wouldn't necessarily be for this coming budget cycle, that it might be something to plug for later, and maybe outside of the formula, but maybe something we, anyway, recommend for the adequacy study if it's not in there already.
Yeah.
I also want to say that the pandemic wasn't felt equivalently across different student groups. Right, it was the at-risk student group and that gap that's changed substantially. I would like for us to recommend that the at-risk weight that was recommended a decade ago is something that we get to by fiscal year 25 as a way to mitigate any potential cliff that would relate to ESSER funding and have it tied to equity and serving the schools that serve all students.
Before we
Can you say more about what you mean? Student type rather than specific programming or other identifiers?
Oh yeah, I think I was commenting on, you know, generally the formula, the way that we project is by student types. We project a certain number of at-risk students based on characteristics, a certain number of second graders. I think we tend to want funds to follow the student based on their student type, rather than saying, you know, we used to have a summer school weight, for example, but the summer school weight is different from an at-risk weight, which it replaced it, because summer school is a specific kind of programming rather than a student type. So I think just generally, my general approach is to have the UPSFF be student types rather than having a specific COVID call out, or a, because I mean, from just a purely mechanics perspective, I wouldn't know how many students to project that are impacted by COVID from a COVID weight. Right? Would I just say everybody? I think that might be the case. But then it feels like we should just put the money in the base weight at that point in the foundation level. So that's the kind of mechanic stuff that I was thinking about when I made the comment.
Thanks.
And Patrice, I just want to jump one more slide. It does deal with the middle school weight. And I just wanted to get through this because it sounds like we're going in a lot of different ways, but just to bring us back to the middle school weight for 1 second. This is a similar slide that we were to the adult weight slide, where if you look along the top, the middle school weight is 1.08, which is $13,413 per student. Using the enrollment audit counts from last year, we had 16,876 students in the middle school grade bands. So the total middle school funding was 226 million. And then just as like an example, what an incremental increase to the middle school weight, like 0.01 would be. So a 0.01 increase to the weight would be $248 per student. So based on the number of middle school students that we have, that would be about a $2 million increase into middle school funding. So as an example, increasing the middle school weight from 1.08 to 1.1 would have a financial impact of $4 million for the district. So just wanted to put that comparison out there. We had shown the adult weight going up to 1.0 because that was in the adequacy study, but there hasn't really been anything to ground us in like what should a middle school weight be. So we just wanted to show what the incremental increase would be if we did just like a 0.01 increase. So
Since we're talking about dollar amounts, oh, sorry, Ryan, if you weren't finished.
I mean, I was just going to say, this is the last slide that we have on the middle school weight discussion. So we can continue with that or expand it into other stuff. But sorry, Abe, go ahead.
Do we know how much like the recommendations from previous reports cost? I think there was this conversation earlier about like what is the role of this group, and I think one way to define that might be to say, in previous years, this group has recommended changes that would cost X dollars, and not that we couldn't go above that or couldn't go below that. It's probably varied substantially, but I am kind of curious. I mean, fully funding moving the at-risk weight from 0.25 to 0.37 is in the over $100 million. So I think that's. I'm just curious about what's the range of recommendations we've made in the past and what do they cost. And I'm happy to look it up if we don't know, I can go do my own homework and report back. But I'm just curious if anyone has an idea about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say that when we have made recommendations in the past, we were figuring out what the dollar amount implications would be. Like, for example, when we were looking at some of the at-risk changes from 2 years ago, like there were like specific amounts, like this is how much it would cost to do this thing or this thing. So we have done that. I don't know if it's actually like in the report or in the recommendations. So I don't know how easy it would be for you to go back and look at that. But as we're coming up with recommendations among this group, like we will be able to attach sort of like the financial impact of that.
I do think it is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say, I think one example of that, the overage weight did not exist before the group made the recommendation to consider it. So whatever you see in the UPSFF shell for overage students, that's a brand new, revenue source for LEAs that wasn't in existence before the 2020 group. Some of them are a little more challenging to tease out because they're increases, but that was a purely new thing after the 2020 group.
And Josh, I see your question. Is there a tool for those costs that you can share with the working group? Yes, I'm basically like what I do is I take our UPSFF shell, and I have all of the enrollment for each of the categories. So is that what you would be interested in seeing?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I know that nobody got on that side. That's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
I think to some of this conversation and previous conversations around trade-offs, I'd be curious to group reactions as we approach the recommendations section. Recommendations portion of just our working group's time together over the next couple months. If it would be helpful to frame, for example, like if the group had $3 million to work with and we were talking about these 4 levers, like what folks' prioritization would be, versus if we had $5 million versus if we had $10 million, to have almost like 2 scenarios of like how constrained, what the trade-offs look like depending on the level of constraint. And do folks feel like their perspectives would actually change based on what that dollar amount looks like?
I mean, I think yes, except I'm still trying to understand what our role is as the working group, right? Like, for me, I'm just speaking from what I think. It's just like I want to recommend that our recommendation is follow the adequacy study. But like, if our job is also to help DME make hard decisions with, we don't have infinite amount of funds, then yes, definitely what you're saying would be helpful.
Yeah, I wanted to add one comment on this topic. I do think it is our role to think through those constraints, and I would be really curious to see the results of a survey that gets at this question that Michelle just asked. I think we have to make a really delicate, walk a really delicate line and balance the idea of saying, hey, look, we really want, a super equitable tool to figure out how we should fund every child's education. But if we make a recommendation to add $1 billion, like the entire thing, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And I just think that it is incumbent upon us, even though it is not this group's job to balance the budget as a group, of course, but it does, I think, it is important that we put forward recommendations that can be adopted or are adoptable and feasible. And I think that question that DME is asking is definitely a worthwhile one. That's just my opinion, though.
I think we have to wrestle, just if our task is to be fair and to figure this out, this comes in the context of the larger city's budget. Also, I mean, I don't want to, I want it to make sense and to feel fair. And I think we're wrestling with lots of different things here. I understand what Kevin said and what you said, Jeanette. This is a more of a permanent thing, but we often make a recommendation or make a comment in our report that doesn't necessarily change the weights, but that lifts up a problem. And so that is one thing we can also do. If there's an area that we want to address or want to say this is something that we want a further look at or a way for the city to wrestle with, we can put some of the things we've talked about in that area. I mean, I think I'm back thinking here toward the end of the meeting of the middle school and the elementary, the adult ed, that somehow in the beginning, it's like education is a huge part of the budget. And we have, as a city, committed to ourselves to educate everybody who wants to be educated, basically. So it's a big thing to wrestle with. And we've kind of said, we're going to do it in the public and charter schools for 3, and there's no end limit for adult ed. So we've said anybody that wants to be educated should come and get educated. So it's a lot we're wrestling with, how to make that affordable.
Michelle, in past iterations of this group, at the end, did we prioritize and weed out, decisions based on money, or was it, these are the recommendations of the group for consideration without having to pair one against the other?
I'm going to defer to Ryan there.
Um,
To try to remember.
yeah. So there's usually, like, in the past, there has usually been 4 to 5 recommendations that the working group comes up with. But they are not, they are all sort of like together, like all of the recommendations are like a single ask, I guess, through the report. It's not like one versus another. Like if you have to pick this one or this one. It's sort of just been like an all-encompassing thing.
But we did last year, or whenever the last time it was we did this, we did take surveys as well to help gauge like where our priorities were landing based on what those different constraint models. Like if we had to do no increases, no net increase, right? If every dollar that we added from somewhere came from somewhere else within the formula, what were our priorities? And then I think we were also surveyed on like, what if that wasn't the case? And what if resources were more generous? And I think that was a really good exercise because it helped us understand each other's priorities. And I think it also slowly helped to like cull the recommendations into a place where we could find consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we did do some surveys and some voting. I do want to like put a bit of an asterisk on that because I feel like, and I can go back, I could be wrong about this. I feel like we were looking at like different methods of funding at-risk students and seeing like which methods would this group prefer. And I don't think it was, would you rather fund adult schools or middle schools? Like we weren't asking folks to make that trade-off. And I think actually like putting a survey together in that regard is a little unfair, just because of the makeup of this group between charter schools and DCPS and the different schools that are being represented. So I do want to just like maybe not do it that way. Like I agree, we can do surveys that would be beneficial, but I just want to be careful about what kind of survey questions like we would be asking this group to sort of like vote on, so as to avoid any kind of like majorities or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a super helpful nuance. Thank you.
I do think it would be helpful to have a similar slide as this one and the one for adults for at-risk weight. Here's the at-risk supplement, and here's what an incremental increase is, because that is another place where the adequacy study weight is recommended weight is above what is currently there, and I think there's general agreement that students designated at risk most likely felt the impact of the pandemic more than other students who were not. Some of the gap analysis that Empower K-12 did sort of bears that out. I think it would be helpful to know what the relative cost of those incremental increases are. Not to mention it generally spread fairly evenly across LEAs, or not across LEAs, but across at least between charters and DCPS.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of questions about and comments similar to yours, Abe, about just what were the costs of some of the changes that we've made. What are the costs of implementing the adequacy study recommendations and stuff. So I think that is something that we can definitely put together for the next meeting.
I think since we just did the big increase on the at-risk, it's been hard to tell what that effect had yet. We spent all of the last session on at risk, mostly, and on high school. So
we're getting towards the end of the time. I do want to make sure that we have the public comment period. So if there is anyone from the public that would like to make a comment, you can do the raise your hand feature and I can unmute you. Or you can just type in the chat to me and to let me know that you want to say something, and I can unmute you. And all of the stuff that is said during the public comment period is included in our working group report. And as always, while we wait for people to raise their hand or whatever, feel free to continue the discussion amongst the panelists too. And yeah, I have not seen anybody, so we can open it back up to any panelists if you have any other comments or anything.
Jack, I know that you had mentioned wanting to revisit special education. Could you share a bit more about what you think would be helpful for the group to take a look at and perspective there?
Sure. I was actually just writing something into the chat. I'd really like to understand more about that data point on students with disabilities during the pandemic seemingly doing better, because that doesn't jive with anything that I have seen. And I think that having looked at the Aussie special education landscape, and some of the concerns that were expressed in that have just pointed opportunities to do better for children with students with disabilities by and large. And the couple of questions that I had with regard to, if we looked at that chart, that is one area that has been flat from the adequacy study on, and the levels. I think Mary Levy was the one who said in one of our earlier meetings that the levels for special education were set at probably 30 years ago, and that I don't think we have a current sense as to what those represent. And just giving some thought to those, given the state of special education in the district, I think would serve us well, at least to get a better understanding of of how funding is working in those areas right now.
And Jack, to your first, I think, observation and curiosity about the gaps for special students with disabilities and students who do not have disabilities. I think if I remember correctly from looking at a different chart that similarly showed this type of information, it's not that students with disabilities necessarily improved. It's that they didn't decline as much relative to the other population, and frankly, because performance
Because
is
it was so
low, and
Yeah,
so there's not as
Yeah,
far to crack.
so
Yeah, so I
mean
think that gap doesn't
that I
quite.
think is that's a really important point to make, because in the landscape analysis, I mean, I think we're somewhere down. I think we're at the absolute bottom, in that almost 0% of children who end up being identified for special education in the District of Columbia ever get back to general education. There was another chart in there that I think was of great concern. So knowing that one of the outcomes of the pandemic has been, I mean, we're involved with early childhood education, and we're seeing more children being identified with disabilities early on. And as we think about these cohorts coming in who have been affected by the pandemic, and we start to see, other issues that may have an effect on how children are educated, it just seems to me now is a good time to just spend some time looking at how we're spending money now and what potential opportunities there are to do things better.
So I am struggling a lot with increasing all of these weights, not because I don't believe the school should be funded, but I'm still stuck on the fundamental problem of staffing shortage. And every one of these things that we're talking about requires more staff for the most part. And I'm wondering if maybe we approach this from like a bigger idea perspective. Is there a way that we can, I don't know, create a weight that goes to fund or remove debt for teachers, or figure out ways that we can attract talent to the district that might, get us the special education teachers that we need, get us the mental health clinicians that get us the, proper student to teacher ratios in middle school and all of that. I'm just making something up off the top of my head here, but that's sort of where I'm at with a lot of this, is that like we can play around with what the needs are in a lot of cases, but like how can we try to figure out a more robust pipeline to really move the needle in the right way?
All right, it's the last meeting before a holiday, so um, I guess it would be nice to give you all a little bit of time back. The next, Patrice, you took the slides down too quick. I think there was the last slide just says our next meeting, which off the top of my head I can't remember now. Let me look. Thursday, December 1st is our next meeting. So we have I have written down a bunch of follow-ups to include. Thank you, Patrice. Thanks so much. So I have a bunch of follow-ups for additional information that the group has asked. So I think we'll definitely look at special education. We'll spend time talking about special education at the next meeting. You can all certainly email myself, Michelle, or Patrice with any other comments or anything, or any questions. And we will see everybody in 3 weeks. So I hope you all have a good holiday tomorrow, and a good weekend. And we will all see you soon. Thank
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you're right. We'll meet after Thanksgiving. So yeah, hope you all have a good Thanksgiving as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.